Hello everybody and welcome. This is the MSSI invited speaker event, and today I'm very happy to welcome Kai Chan. Professor Chan is from the Institute of Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC, where he's been for 14 years. Despite apparently not originally wanting to become an academic, he did do a PhD in evolutionary biology and a certificate in policy at Princeton, where he also did ethics research with the famous Peter Singer. He then did a postdoc at the Centre for Conservation Biology in Stanford. He's a member of Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists. He's a coordinating lead author of the upcoming Global Assessment Report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so that's IPBES. He describes himself as an interdisciplinary problem-solving sustainability scientist trained in ecology, politics, policy, and ethics, who strives to understand how social ecological systems can be transformed to be both better and wilder. And he also says, our responsibilities to current and future persons in the natural world call for us all to be social and environmental advocates and activists. He's worked hard to keep a role in practice and public policy making, and maintains that policy is not just about economics. He's concerned that when it comes to the environment, the descriptive sciences haven't had a seat at the table that they maybe merit. And for the last 10 years, he's been working on applying the social science concept of relational values to sustainability, something that he's going to talk to us about today in his talk, which is titled Charting a New Path Along the Environmental Policy Tightrope. So please welcome Kai Chan. Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. I haven't been to McGill in 20 years, so it's really fun to be here now. I'm going to talk to you about a whole bunch of different things, and we'll see how we go. Heather, when should I aim to wrap up?
Maybe 40.
40 minutes.
We will have wine at 5.
Mm-hmm. So we'll need talks.
So
yeah.
Finish by 4.
Yeah. Okay.
But it would be nice to have some questions.
Yeah, great. So the context that I've been thinking about most recently, given the last 2.5, almost 3 years working on the IPBES global assessment, is this context here. One of climate change, where we really need to turn things around very quickly, right? This is the trajectory that we're on, and the green paths are the ones that we really need to be on. Similarly, when you think about it in terms of biodiversity, this is a kind of, biodiversity index and a bleak picture of going downwards in this context, despite multiple major policy or intergovernmental interventions. And what we need to do over the next few years is, again, bend the curve, so to speak, in terms of the Convention for Biological Diversity, and really turn things around, ideally on this green trajectory that shows a marked improvement in biodiversity outcomes even before 2050. Now that is a huge undertaking. It's one that we've been thinking about, as I said, over the last 2.5 years. The chapter that I'm coordinating at the IPBES Global Assessment is the one that actually assumes that we make that trajectory turnaround, right? The one kind of optimistic one in the whole assessment. Now, that's the context, but we're gonna start in a kind of much narrower place today, thinking about payments for ecosystem services and how we might transform those in order to involve and reward stakeholders, that's the subtitle, without giving away the farm. And in that process, we'll talk about maybe the transformation from payments for ecosystem services to rewards for environmental stewardship, PES to RES. Then we're going to start thinking about policy mixes and how you can layer those kinds of tools as reinvented with relational values in with other kinds of approaches like certification. And then if I have time, which I don't think I will, given that, other elements of place-based approaches that are already being connected with certification. I may talk about consumers, again, time permitting, and then about bringing together several of these different ideas in an idea that I call CoSphere, or an initiative that we call CoSphere, and a label that we think of now as Earth Positive. At the moment, you could argue that the status quo is that we think about these different environmental, social, ecological problems in a kind of compartmentalized way. So we want Canadian agriculture, so we have production subsidies of various kinds, including supply management. We want Canadian species and ecosystem services, and so we've got, say, the Species at Risk Act, and also Environmental Impact Assessment Acts, etc. Unfortunately, these things don't work well together, and in fact, you can actually argue that they kind of counteract each other. With the production subsidies yielding high intensity of agriculture that often operates at the expense of the environment, and unfortunately also generally a conglomeration of factory farms at the expense of family farming, while the Species at Risk Act, trying to counteract some of those negative environmental externalities, unfortunately has the effect that the restrictions are kind of a bad luck lottery, landing on those landowners who happen to have endangered species or species at risk on their lands, which thus leads to resentment on behalf of those landowners who lose that lottery, and a backlash in the form of the triple shush, the shoot, shovel, shut up phenomenon, where you do away with those endangered species before the federal agencies figure out that they're there on your land and restrict what you would want to do with it. The issue here is that it isn't only agriculture that we collectively want for these landscapes. We also want life-supporting working landscapes. And so that's where many have seen a role for payments for ecosystem services. And this is the departure point, where we're going to think about how we can work these two bits together in a more creative kind of way. These ideas actually first came about when I was asked to give the keynote address at the stakeholder consultation when the BC Ministry of the Environment was trying to give shape to the legislation that they're introducing around species at risk and potentially around endangered ecosystems. What I was arguing for was thinking about, they were taking a very kind of stakeholder-friendly approach that was light on the kind of stick and heavy on the carrots. What I was arguing for was to think about these things together in an integrated way, realizing that the carrots, if they don't come from the sticks, that they're going to be extremely costly and potentially quite ineffective. So how do we make that policy mix work? To introduce you to payments for ecosystem services, they're one kind of a market-based approach. And they're a kind that has been seen as often starting with downstream water users, realizing that there's something that they benefit from that has to do with the ecosystem. Often it's clean water, right? And they realize that, well, clean water gets degraded in the upstream, or the water purifying ecosystem services maybe get degraded in the upstream. And so if they could organize themselves to pay for those upstream communities to do things differently, then maybe you could have a change in ecosystem services, a change in water quality that would benefit those downstream communities and be something worth paying for. This idea was largely behind The Economist back in 2005, declaring that maybe market-based environmentalism could rescue, and the idea of ecosystem services could rescue environmentalism, which they had recently declared to be dead. But there are also major detractors, as you might imagine. When anything that The Economist loves, somebody else is going to hate. And in this paper from 2017, several of my students and a collaborator from the Copenhagen Business School and I set out to reveal and discuss 7 major categories of problems associated with payments for ecosystem services schemes, and also how you could rethink the schemes in order to address those problems, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes in a really interesting and systemic way. The first problem is the problem of new externalities. That anytime you introduce a new market or a new incentive for one particular kind of thing, that you then give rise to a whole set of behaviors that seek to optimize that particular thing at the expense of other things. And so we've seen this with carbon storage from RED+ programs for climate change, for example, where the notion that the effort to sequester carbon or store carbon in soils and in biomass has led to carbon plantations of, say, eucalyptus forests that may indeed sequester carbon quite rapidly, but may also undermine the structure of soils, may be deserts for biodiversity, may draw down the water table or draw it up in salinification zones. And so we call this problem a cure for every ill and an ill for every cure. The second problem is the problem of misplacing rights and responsibilities. And so, sorry about the word wrap here from the font change between the Macs and the PCs. The issue here, so this is the same diagram that I put up earlier of the watersheds, but put into bubbles and arrows. So you've got your downstream beneficiaries, again, but here they are, and you've got your upstream land users, landowners here. Now, the way that these programs are supposed to work is that you can get started on them, often without active involvement of the governments. But what that means is that it places the responsibility squarely on the ecosystem service beneficiaries, which might be appropriate when it's Coca-Cola moving in with a new bottling plant, say in the Peruvian Andes, right? And you've got subsistence landowners or tenure holders in the upstream community, and where clean water is a resource that those companies might pay for. But it's a different circumstance entirely when you've got the subsistence landowners in the downstream who are suffering from degrading activities associated with industrial mines, say, that have moved into the upstream. When those subsistence users have relied for time immemorial upon those ecosystem services without the capacity or the interest in paying for them anew. So what that does, in effect, is it provides a right to those degraders, to those landowners, to be ecosystem service degraders in the upstream unless they're paid to do otherwise. And that's really problematic. The third problem is called motivational crowding out. The notion of these incentive programs is that if we layer on top of the existing incentive structure a new positive or negative incentive in the form of a fine or a cash payment, that we ought to be able to buy behavior change in a cost-effective way. Now, that doesn't always work well, and the best illustration of that comes from this paper from 2000 in the psychology literature, where Israeli psychologists went to 2 daycares in Israel and introduced a late penalty for parents who were showing up late. So that fine was introduced in the black line, and where there was a control daycare that didn't have a fine introduced. The fine introduced in week 5 was followed by a rapid increase in lateness in that treatment group that stayed up at about double the control. And even after that fine was removed in, I think it was week 17. Now, a lot of puzzled looks here for those who haven't heard of this before. The reason for that is the title of the article by Nisi and Rusticini, that a fine is a price. Previous to the fine being introduced, there were already pre-existing motivations for parents to show up on time. There were relational motivations of respect for others. And what happened when the fine was introduced was that it was interpreted as an extension of the fee-for-service model that they already enjoyed for the rest of the workday. They already had hard constraints that prevented them from showing up on time some of the time. But the moral motivation was strong, and the financial motivation not nearly so strong, such that it became more appropriate from their perspective to pay for the extra time than to miss whatever else they were having to do. The same problem bears out with positive incentives in the form of payments for ecosystem services schemes, where you can crowd out the pre-existing moral motivations for these landowners or farmers to practice good stewardship on their land. The fourth problem is the problem of the trade-off between efficiency and equity, where smallholders especially often get left out of these programs because the transaction costs and the institutional knowledge that is necessary to navigate these bureaucratic channels means that large landowners and large corporations are those that are much better poised to realize the benefits associated with these. So smallholders often get left out. The fifth problem is the problem of costly burdens of monitoring. If the money is for an action that you don't actually really want to do, and if the motivation is primarily for the money, then cheating pays, and so you're going to need to pay a lot for policing. And that's what we see with the vast majority of these kinds of programs, especially those associated with the RED Plus and carbon offset markets, where the vast majority of the money that goes into these programs actually goes towards lawyers and auditors and monitors, rather than on-the-ground change in ecosystems. The sixth problem is that this is a great solution to a problem that almost nobody actually has, in the sense that it was envisioned initially as a Coasian solution, meaning that these two parties, right, the upstream communities and the downstream communities, could basically negotiate the terms of an agreement that was or is payments for ecosystem services programs. The problem is, of course, that if you can't get enough of the upstream community to change their behavior, then you don't realize any real benefits in water quality. If the water quality is still too poor that you need to build a filtration plant, then why bother with the payment for ecosystem services program? Similarly, if not enough of the downstream water users can get on board with this kind of an arrangement, then those that want to are deeply suspicious of the freeloading of those who don't. And thus, deals break down all the time. The seventh problem is the problem of top-down prescription from state agencies often. Because when these Coasian solutions break down, often it's the state governments that step in and work on behalf of the public benefits. But when they do that, and if they interpret the actions that are needed in a narrowly constrained way, i.e. plant a certain number of trees or set aside a hectare of forest for this many dollars, then what this often yields is a recoil from the landowners and farmers who think that they know better, right? And who often do know better about what is good stewardship on the land. And so Molly Chapman, as one of the co-authors on this piece in 2017, her work in Washington State has shown that what was supposed to be no-touch buffers for the sake of salmon, many farmers were resisting those as actually counterproductive from the perspective of environmental stewardship. They wanted to get in there and manage the Himalayan blackberries, but the state had told them that they were not allowed to manage that stretch of vegetation alongside rivers because it would interfere with the outcomes for salmon. Arguably, they were wrong, and removing the blackberries could actually work perfectly well with salmon in the long term. So, these 7 problems laid out all here, they all have solutions. And that's where we're going to go next. Partway there was this accident called bush tender in the state of Victoria in Australia, which was a reverse auction, meaning that the state put out a call for proposals for land management changes that would be good for bushland protection, so wildlife protection effectively. The hope was that they could have more economically efficient outcomes by yielding effective competition between landowners. They were worried about collusion between landowners in the form of, if you can imagine, 3 landowners in a single valley where they know that the last remaining population of some endangered frog is living. Arguably, they could get together and say, you know, let's all of us ask for more than this amount of money, right? A kind of price floor that, that could yield inefficiencies from the state perspective in terms of bringing about wildlife outcomes. What they actually found was almost certainly the opposite, was a substantial underbidding, where many landowners and farmers were willing to put in a lot of their own blood, sweat, and tears into these projects that were really good for bushland protection, but also aligned with their own objectives for that land. And when you have that, and especially when you've got it labeled as a kind of bushland protection or environmental stewardship kind of enterprise, what you've got is the possibility for the avoidance of cognitive dissonance to kick in a very positive way. Where the only way for a landowner to reconcile the notion that they are a rational land manager with the notion that they sunk a whole lot of their own time into putting up this fence to keep their cattle out of the streams, for example, is by realizing and owning that part of their identity that actually is a land steward. So this is where relational values enter, where I've been arguing, as Heather said, for years, that we can't forget these values. And that if we don't systematically try to foster not only ecologically sensitive behaviors, but also norms and identities, relational values, that we're going to fail to achieve sustainability. We're going to fail on that, bending the curve kind of project that we are arguably on. The classical way of understanding what matters in ecosystems or in the environment is to understand it in terms of either intrinsic or instrumental values. Either the value that nature has kind of independent of people, or the value that it has through what it delivers to us in terms of pleasure or satisfaction. Those two schools of thought are just fine, but they're not a complete picture of what matters to people. Arguably, they're also relational values, principles, preferences, and virtues about human relationships also involving nature. And these can take the form of individual-oriented relational values, like this place being really important to me, to who I am as a person, that my care for this land fulfills me in a way that I can't imagine a good life without it, or that keeping the land healthy is just the right thing to do. Or you can think of them in collective terms, about who we are as a people, about responsibility to other people, where that responsibility is mediated through the environment. So you can take it further, right? From payments for ecosystem services programs to reverse auctions to even thinking about rewards for environmental stewardship, where the question is effectively, land steward, how can we help you do more? What that would mean would be rewarding the practice of stewardship, not just a single output like carbon that could yield new externalities. Where we pay the steward, not the would-be polluter, not to pollute. Where we use a co-payment program expecting that the land stewards are going to put in something of themselves, something of their own time and or resources in a way that will complement rather than crowd out those intrinsic motivations. Where we forget about the small-scale additionality that led to many of these PES programs leaving aside the smallholders, and we focus instead on making a program that feels right and fair, that people want to participate in, and that therefore is sustainable in a kind of financial sense. Focusing on the value change and the norm change that has real power at the scale of watersheds or regions. When you have a situation where people are mostly doing the actions because they wanted to do them anyway, then you worry a lot less about cheating. And so then you've got the possibility that you can enforce, in a sense, through peer monitoring, just like Princeton University did with their honor code for cheating, academic cheating. If we can bring in others, and I'm going to pull this one out much later in the talk, if we can bring in other sources of payment, if we can recognize that if this is about responsibility and these extractive activities are fueling the production of goods and services that we all consume all over the world, then you can think about broadening this Coasian solution into something much bigger, much more applicable. And if we do structure it in this way, about asking those land stewards how we can help them do more, then we're engaging them and their knowledge of their land and their creativity in a way that goes way beyond the kind of this many pesos per tree or per hectare. So what that means, this is the old diagram adding in the auditors who get so much of the money, the auditors and the lawyers and the monitors, and recognizing that these proactive stewards are mostly actually being left out. Because those folks who are already practicing, the land conservation, putting aside the buffers, the stream buffers, et cetera, they weren't eligible for payments under the old model because we needed small-scale additionality. We needed them to do something different. But in the rewards for environmental stewardship model, you bring in those folks and also the supply chains, the folks who are ultimately responsible, in a way that you share the costs with producers or extractors or with proactive stewards, providing payments, often in kind, in a way that shares the responsibility across all of those actors. I'm not going to go into detail on this, and I don't expect you to read any of it, but these are the 7 problems on the left, the suggested shifts in the center, and then particular tools in new approaches on the right. And then you can layer on top of that the relational values that are at the heart of these. Values of stewardship, of shared responsibility, of equity, fairness, honor, trust, shared responsibility, stewardship, and sovereignty. And so this is really a relational turn to a very market-oriented neoclassical economic tool. So if we think about that species at risk lottery, and we start to think about these policy mixes, if you think about those landowners who previously suffered only bad luck when they discovered an endangered or a species at risk on their land, and you think about the possibility of enabling some flexibility for what they can do with that land coming from offsets, where those offsets might be paid by a number of different people, not just by degraders, but not just by developers, which is the current context, but also by those of us who as individuals or as, say, retailers or other firms would like to mitigate the negative impacts that we have on the environment, then you've got the opportunity for a stewardship program to really have power, to change the perceptions on the ground associated with these kinds of substantial environmental legislations. Now, what that means is that these offsets have to be real. They have to be in hand. They can't be the promise of future action when you've already degraded the environment. And they must be mediated transactions, not things that are out there to be traded and speculated, where most of the profits go towards rich parties who can consolidate and set aside those credits until the market is ripe to bring them out. What that would mean would be that finding species at risk on one's land would mean changing the opportunities that are available. And that could mean a real change in the perceptions of what it means to be a landowner. And so with a policy mix for species at risk, we can have these recognition and grants for environmental stewardship operating together with bans about what you can't do about species at risk in a way that yields agriculture that spares or nurtures the environment, that yields another kind of product to grow, another revenue stream potentially, and agriculture that can be sustained, arguably, even in the face of trade disputes that that take issue with those production subsidies. And potentially strengthened norms and cultures of stewardship on the land. Now, I'm gonna take the shortcut. I'm still going to talk about certification, but I'm going to skip out of the consumers bit unless we get to that in the questions. The issue here with certification is that at the moment, certification is the primary way that we as individuals or retailers can be involved in the project of sustainability, right? And the way that certification works is effectively like this. You've got a supply chain that is thick, which benefits largely from the economies of scale. And when you introduce a certified product, like say organic apples, beside conventional apples, then you have to maintain that as a distinct supply chain throughout every step so that the consumers are actually realizing something different, that they know what they're getting is that it is different, which means that you also need a separate kind of marketing team. Now, the effect of this is that organic products and most certified products are a lot more costly because you have ruined the economies of scale and made these products much more expensive just because that money is going towards erecting and maintaining a supply chain that is not thick, that does not benefit from those economies of scale, and that also has a great restriction in terms of choice, where often the kind of certification, the bird-friendly certification that you might want for your chocolate doesn't apply to, say, Cocoa Puffs, right, or other products, and is only found in your kind of 70% or higher cocoa content organic chocolate bar. So just like with payments for ecosystem services programs, you can think about a whole bunch of different challenges that are associated with certification. The first is that they're costly. The second is that no matter how we do it, these products are all still having residual impacts. There might be less, but there are still impacts associated with organic agriculture, for example. And other kinds of problems as well, where once a label comes up as being prominent, then people expect more of it, right? And so with the RSPO, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which I've had occasion to get to know a lot better, they've had to take on labor standards as a really significant project as part of their label because they have been expected to do so as being a better operator. At the core, though, I think one of the most fundamental issues with certification programs is that there are way too many issues. And every issue has its own family of labels, which means that the problem from a consumer or a retailer's perspective is one of way too much complexity. So on this slide, there are a couple of forestry labels. There's the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and there's the FSC, which is the Forest Stewardship Council. One of these is a NGO-led but industry-involved, third-party verified chain of custody certification system. And one of them is effectively an industry knockoff intended to obfuscate consumers, confuse consumers. So hands up if the original NGO-led is SFI. Hands up. Hands up if it's FSC. And hands up if you don't really know. It's most of you. Thank you for being honest. Yeah, it's FSC that is the the NGO-led chain of custody one. But it's crucial to realize that you are here in this room because of your deep knowledge and interest in these issues. But even you cannot be expected to disentangle the complexity of all these problems. And then even once you do, there is still contention about who's right. In the face of all that complexity, what most people do, right? Those who do not identify squarely as environmentalists, they check out. It's too much complexity. It's too much contention. They just throw up their hands and they focus on maybe 3 things that they'll do for environmentalism, right? They'll recycle, maybe now they will compost, and I don't know what else, right? But not a whole lot more than that. The 5th problem with certification is that associated with the residual impacts, they rely on a less bad logic. And that's not enough to motivate some people. Because of the complexity and because of the costliness, they effectively also rely on a deep green identity. Environmentalism's to the core, which unfortunately, because it requires so much of an investment in knowledge, as well as an investment in time, and often kind of compromising in terms of simplicity and convenience, it's not inspiring to the rest of the world, but rather actually completely uninspiring, which causes people to recoil from an environmentalist identity and decide that that is not who they are, which is a massive problem when we think about the grand challenge of sustainability and the need to mainstream these kinds of behaviors that are conducive to sustainability. So effectively, we've got environmentalists over here, you know, the kind of mountain climbers, the ones who are willing to go to epic lengths to do what they see as right, and the rest as not being on that same mountain at all. They don't even buy into the project. And that's a problem that we really need to address. So I have a segue here that I often go into, which is intended to persuade you that actually consumers have often been written off as not being sufficiently concerned as to play a major role in this turnaround. And I argue for a bunch of reasons that actually that's not true. One piece of it comes from this first set of empirical results about relational values, where don't worry about the complexity. We've got 3 different populations here: Costa Rican farmers, Amazon users in the northeast of the US, and tourists in Costa Rica who come from the US and Canada. We've got different categories of value prompts in the different colors. And what's really important to recognize, the kind of one thing that I want you to see on this chart, is that, you know, this kind of universal gold standard environmental value of the importance of the environment for providing clean air and clean water, that's this one here, the purple one on the far left. Almost everybody agrees with that. Agreeing almost as strongly with that in the 2 populations where we had both of them, and with at least that amount of certainty in the population where we didn't even ask that question, is this really strong morally tinged value towards others. That humans have a responsibility to account for our impacts to the environment because they can harm other people. This is the kind of relational value that you could arguably leverage into real systemic change. And I would go further into that to explain a second set of empirical findings that suggest that actually consumers will pay more when they are involved in the right kind of way, when it's built in, and when they have the opportunity to reward brands who do good. Now, I had a second segue, which I will also mostly avoid, which is about smallholders and the possibility of jurisdictional approaches to certification, which helps to solve some of the problems associated with certification programs. But I'm going to go back to certification and the value to action gap, right? So I put up that slide with the relational values. People state a strong sense of responsibility towards others associated with the environment. And yet, arguably, we're all participating in these supply chains where we are consuming products for ourselves and knowing that those products have impacts on people elsewhere. And the environmental impacts are largely negative ones. So how do we reconcile those? How do we close that gap? Well, the answer is effectively make it simple, make it enjoyable, and make it not too expensive. And the parallel to that is smartphones, right? Not too expensive to do something that you kind of already want to do. And that's how smartphones rose from being nothing to being everywhere in the span of just 5 years, effectively. Note that I said not too expensive. I didn't say cheap. I don't think it needs to be cheap, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it doesn't need to be. What matters more is the easy and the enjoyable. And from the perspective of identities, arguably, people won't even identify themselves as being concerned until they can take action in a way that they can fit in with their daily lives. So instead of the kind of plethora of labels that you encounter in the grocery store, where you know that some of them are a little less bad, but you know that some of them are intentional obfuscating enterprises, I want you to imagine going into a grocery store where you've got, when you buy a pound of shrimp, if you're interested in buying shrimp, you know that the getting of that shrimp often comes with bycatch, right? But when you buy it, there is a side payment that goes alongside separately to mitigate that bycatch, to mitigate the negative effects on sea turtles, on albatross, on sharks, on other kinds of species, maybe in the shrimp fishery, maybe in the tuna fishery, maybe in beach protection programs for nesting turtles. But one way or another, we can quantify the negative impacts that we have through our consumption of that amount of shrimp, and we can pay to fix those damages. And if those were built in, if they were featured there for you in an opt-out fashion in the grocery store, then arguably it's the kind of thing that lots of people would do. Imagine it also for beef, where instead of feeling super bad about buying beef at all, because it's kind of the environmental poster child of degradation, and not knowing whether grass-fed beef or grain-fed beef is better or worth it, but all kinds of beef were coupled with a payment that went towards carbon offsets in the form of subsidizing community centers and schools and skating rinks to be built in a much more energy efficient way so that you can realize those kind of offsets, as well as also helping farmers to put in those fences alongside the streams to keep the cattle from getting in there and muddying up those streams, causing erosion and the loss of riparian vegetation, biodiversity, causing sedimentation downstream, etc. You can think about the same thing in a palm oil context, but I'm not going to go into the details because I didn't really talk about that. What this means is a different kind of solution where we're trying to work with both supply chains, not to undermine the organic and those special labels, but rather actually to boost them up, where by setting a norm that all of these labels should be mitigating their impacts, right? The mainstream impacts or the residual impacts. And this is a way, if you put that funding into a central kind of organizing institution that had a participatory, place-based way of deciding what the key priorities are for the ecosystem services and biodiversity concerns that are of greatest concern locally, and the kinds of actions that are most important and most appropriate locally, then you can imagine a system by which we bring about environmental protection in a way that is socially just and also helps to change markets, helps to change supply chains. I think about this as the infrastructure for sustainability. Bullet trains are great, but not everybody is going to ride a bullet train in their life. Everybody needs to have an easy and enjoyable means of mitigating the negative impacts of all of their consumption. And that's what we're thinking about with this initiative called CoSphere, which stands for a community of small planet heroes, ecologically regenerating economies. The notion is that at the moment, you kind of have to be Katniss Everdeen to be a hero on this small planet where all of our actions have negative repercussions elsewhere. But we need to build it to the point where this is a revolution that everybody can participate in, right? Where everybody can be a small planet hero. We think about this in terms of the innovation diffusion curve, where so many environmental initiatives have focused on the innovators and helping those mountain climbers get to the top of the mountain in a more sophisticated way. Not realizing that doing that is actually turning off the early majority and the late majority, let alone the laggards, right? And so the plan here is to start with the innovators in a way that really quickly moves on to the early adopters, with the plan being that you can get to the early majority once you've got those first two segments of the population. And we don't need to worry about the laggards, actually. By the time we get down to the last 16%, that's when you appeal to regulations to make it normal across whole jurisdictions. So the key features of CoSphere are that it reaches beyond conscientious consumers to include all people by leveraging widely held existing values of responsibility, by making it easy, enjoyable, and inexpensive to mitigate environmental impacts. The notion is that it would have one label. One label would certify a product as being net positive in addition to any other labels it might have, it would mean any residual impacts associated with being organic are being mitigated, promoting a widespread normalization across all kinds of products. It would mitigate impacts efficiently. And because it can be applied to any product, it would not have that problem of restricting the choice, which would thereby help to lessen the divide between the kind of greenies and the rest of the world. So making it less costly, addressing residual impacts, potentially also other problems, helping to solve that cacophony problem, appealing to people's notions of trying to have a net positive impact. And so moving beyond the green identity, appealing to core values of responsibility that are widely shared. So to sum up the first part of the talk, the existing tools are not sufficient for working landscapes. All of the policies that we employ articulate rights and responsibilities. So it's time for us to design those in a way that cultivates, not suppresses, stewardship, norms, and identity, relational values, by paying for what we want and what we need. Not just products, but also ecosystem services. And not just services, but also stewardship. And then to sum up the whole of it, existing tools are really powerful, but they're actually kind of acting at cross purposes. Because concerned consumers are being left out of this transformation towards sustainability. And we need to give them an easy and positive way to express their values. Enlisting everyday heroes by enabling their actions inclusively. And I want to say this is not a fundamentally novel idea. It's just pulling little bits from a wide variety of different places and integrating them into a smart policy mix. We're going to launch something big this spring or summer, and we'd love any help that you might offer if any of these ideas appeal, or even if you have ideas for why it wouldn't work or things that we should look out for. We're really keen to hear all of those. It's a project of UBC at the moment, but may eventually become a standalone organization. Whatever we do, we somehow need to find a way to include everybody in the project of sustainability, not only appeal to the deep green. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much. Plenty of food for thought, and I think most of us can really empathize with a lot of those problems when we're faced with all these different labels and we just have no idea what to do. So practical solutions, we've got about 5 minutes, and then after that we've got, we've got about an hour, half an hour to 45 minutes outside where you can also speak to Kai. But are there any burning questions? Yes. So Kai will repeat your question for the microphone. Okay.
My question's rather comprehensive. I just wanted to thank you. And you're dealing always with renewable resources. I come from an industry called mining. They aren't renewable. They're depleted every time you take something from the ground. And it's kind of the opposite. But it's in equal bad shape like your version of it. And I saw your some there speak, shut up at the end there, but 3 S's.
Shoot, shovel, shut up. Yeah.
We got the same expression in mining.
Yeah.
Shut up and drill, stupid. Suds. We call it suds. Mm-hmm. In other words, until you get the dollar sign put on it, in other words, you all of a sudden it explodes, and it doesn't matter what you do. It's all for the dollar, as you know.
So the question is about how does this apply to non-renewable, natural resources, and especially non-renewable ones. I think that the first part is that all of these extractive industries do have impacts on ecosystems, right? So it's not only thinking about the renewable resources, but all of them. Now, the issue involved with depleting a non-renewable resource is another issue. I don't want to say too much about that. I mean, one part of it is that it could conceivably be addressed by ensuring that recycling programs are in place for resource recovery. And that's applicable for some kinds of non-renewable resources. For others, like fossil fuels, which are effectively non-renewable on our timescales, arguably, it's not, what matters is not that fossil fuels are being depleted, but rather that we provide not only energy, but also a livable climate, right? And so in that sense, I'd say that fossil fuels, although they're a non-renewable resource, are still, you could still think about them as operating in the same kind of way, in the sense that what we could substitute with a renewable energy, right?
Supply management that was not settled by the new NAFTA agreement. Why not? I mean, it's a bad thing to have in there. It's not signed yet by the Congress. Yet, what's your comment on that? Should they gone further?
So the question is about supply management, which I mentioned really briefly in terms of the trade disputes. And yeah, so it was something that the Americans took aim at. I mean, realistically, I don't think it was something that they ever expected to be dismantled, but kind of an excuse, actually, for pushing on other things. The Canadian lobby is strong. I mean, I don't really want to say that much about supply management. My issue isn't with any particular form of production subsidy, with any particular form, but rather with production subsidies in general, and with the notion that, yeah, I mean, I do think that production subsidies should be reformed so as not to be encouraging production, but rather to be encouraging responsible stewardship. For producers, sure, that's fine, but and why that hasn't happened more yet, I think there are a bunch of reasons for that. But I think it's something that I'm keen to learn more about and to see if there are some opportunities there. Yeah.
So one question. Yeah.
In Montreal, we get lots of snow. We just had 40 centimeters of snow. And it's plowed first, and then it's trucked away. We would spend millions and millions of dollars with thousands and thousands of truckloads of snow to move it out of the way, which only encourages people to drive their car more in the winter. So you've got policies, people who are normally environmentally conscious are encouraging and clearing the snow away so they can drive their car. So it's a dilemma. How do you solve a problem like that?
So the question is around the snow, and as just one example of basically perverse actions, right? Where legislators actually work to solve one problem, but in doing so encourage behaviors that are counterproductive from a sustainability perspective. The answer isn't not to move the snow, unfortunately, right? Because even buses actually also require snow removal. But I think with many of these things, the solution is actually in structural matters that take years and years to resolve, right? And so the solution is to build our communities in a way that they are serviceable by rapid public transit. But that's not the kind of thing that can happen overnight. And in the meantime, while we're stuck with the infrastructure that we are, then we've got to operate one way or another. And so it's not just the snow removal; it's also the widespread application of salt, which is kind of ghastly from the perspective of Vancouver, right, where we don't really do that much. In the meantime, we're going to have to do some things that are just kind of propping up unsavory behaviors. But the more that we can unhelpful, kind of unsustainable behaviors. But the more that we can recognize that and be involved and active in terms of bringing about the structural solutions to those, and the better.
I have one question, sorry, which is,
Heather.
Have you spoken to farmers on
Yeah.
different scales about this, and what do they think?
Yeah, we have. I mean, this work is, I should have said this, I said it kind of incidentally. So that paper, that is a conceptual paper, is actually based on work from all three of those students of mine, Paige Olmsted and Emily Anderson and Molly Chapman. And then we've done other work with farmers in BC, led by Adrian Semelink. So lots of interviews and surveys with farmers. Mayanne Kreitzman actually has been doing interviews in the Midwest with perennial agriculture farmers. And these ideas definitely resonate broadly. I mean, many of them. The kind of, the relational turn to the ecosystem service programs is one that farmers would appear to really like across all of these populations, with very few exceptions. Interestingly, in Costa Rica, Molly Chapman did her dissertation research there, and she interviewed folks across the whole program for payments for ecosystem services. The national program in Costa Rica is one of the most famous ones in the world, one of the longest standing ones. And what she found was that actually the intermediaries in that program were working to talk both sides, right? So they were using very economic language to explain what they were doing and to fit in with what their higher-ups were dictating, right? To treat this as a transaction, this is an economic kind of solution, right? These are payments. The head of the program actually said, it's like a taxi ride, We pay them when we get in, we go along on a journey together, and then we get out and they can go and do whatever they want, right? That's how he liked it. But the farmers, meanwhile, were thinking about this in very relational terms. It was like, this is a recognition for the good work that we are already doing. This is a way to help us to continue to be farmers because the state supports us in producing food and all the else that goes along with it, right? So they were interpreting those, and that was coming from the intermediaries who were actually using relational logics to talk to the farmers, and then the economic logics to talk to the suppliers. And so, these ideas, they are already out there. They're not primary in terms of the program design at the moment, but there are ways that we can make it so.
Okay. So we do have the wine and cheese outside. You're welcome to ask more questions if you wish. And meanwhile, can we all thank Kai Chan for a very interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sustainable bag.
Nice. Great.
With a sustainable gift.
Wonderful. I just want to say one word about this journal, People in Nature. If you're frustrated with publishing, especially in the interdisciplinary space, this new journal from the British Ecological Society, so run and owned by a reputable professional association, not by a for-profit publisher. It's deeply interdisciplinary, it's open access, and I'm one of the lead editors. I believe in it super strongly. That's why I'm a lead editor. I highly encourage any of you to submit your work that is at the intersection of people and nature. Thank you.